Long before the rise of the great empires, before the construction of temples and cathedrals, there were the Druids, mystical figures, keepers of nature's secrets, and guardians of an ancient wisdom stretching back thousands of years. Though their words were never written down, their influence echoed across the British Isles, Ireland, and beyond. Who were the Druids? What secrets did they hold? And how did this mysterious spirituality, rooted in the land and stars, evolve from ancient times to the modern world? Join us as we explore the fascinating journey of Druidism, from its prehistoric beginnings and its role in Celtic society, to its revival in the modern era as a global spiritual movement. This is the untold story of the Druids, a path of wisdom, mystery, and nature. Welcome to the world of Druidry. So sit back, close your eyes, and let sleep drift over you as we explore the world of Druids. Approximately 2,500 years ago, and likely even earlier, two spiritual traditions began to develop at opposite ends of the vast Indo-European cultural arc. These traditions, nurtured by tribal societies, would eventually grow into major spiritual movements with millions of adherents worldwide. In the eastern end of this arc, in the fertile plains of the Indus Valley, what would later become the great Hindu and Jain religions began to take form. These ancient systems of belief drew on the sacred texts of the Vedas, a collection of hymns and prayers that described a universe infused with divine energy, cycles of life, death, and rebirth, and an intricate set of rituals designed to maintain cosmic order, or dharma. While the religious traditions of India were flourishing and evolving, something quite different was taking root in the far western reaches of the Indo-European world. In Western Europe, particularly in the British Isles, Ireland, and parts of Gaul, modern-day France, Druidism emerged as a distinct spiritual path. This ancient system of belief, associated with the Celtic peoples, shared with the Eastern traditions a reverence for the natural world, but its practices, symbols, and deities reflected the unique landscapes and cultural history of Europe. Druidism's origins, however, are not as well documented as those of its Eastern counterparts. There are no Vedic texts to guide us, no written records from the Druids themselves. Instead, we rely on the accounts of classical writers, the myths and legends of the Celtic peoples, and archaeological discoveries to piece together a picture of this enigmatic spiritual tradition. What we do know is that Druidism was deeply rooted in the natural world, with a strong emphasis on the cycles of nature, the sacredness of groves, rivers, and stone circles, and a belief in the immortality of the soul. The earliest references to Druidism in written sources come from Greek and Roman writers around 200 BCE, though these texts have been lost to history. By 50 BCE, the Roman general Julius Caesar had written extensively about the Druids in his commentaries on the Gallic War. Caesar claimed that Druidism originated in Britain and later spread to Gaul, though modern scholars have questioned this. What is certain is that Druidism was practiced by the Celtic tribes of the British Isles, Ireland, and parts of Western Gaul, though its influence may not have extended much further than this. The Druids were not simply priests. They were philosophers, judges, teachers, and healers. They held a position of great authority within Celtic society, and their influence extended beyond the spiritual realm into the realms of law, education, and politics. According to Caesar, the Druids were responsible for settling disputes, interpreting omens, and conducting religious ceremonies, including sacrifices. Some accounts also suggest that they were skilled astronomers and could predict celestial events, further enhancing their status as wise and learned individuals. Although written accounts of Druidism began over 200 years ago, it is likely that the tradition itself is much older. Druidism likely evolved out of earlier religious practices that were common among the Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples of Europe. These early forms of spirituality were deeply animistic and shamanistic, with a strong emphasis on the connection between humans and the natural world. As we explore the history of Druidism, it is important to keep in mind that it did not emerge fully formed, but rather evolved over millennia, drawing on the religious practices and beliefs of the peoples who came before. Long before the Druids emerged as a distinct group, the prehistoric inhabitants of Western Europe engaged in a rich tapestry of religious and spiritual practices. These early forms of spirituality are evidenced by the remarkable archaeological finds scattered across the region. One of the most significant of these finds is the site at Paviland, located on the Gower Peninsula near Swansea in Wales. Here, in the early 19th century, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a skeleton known as the Red Lady of Paviland. Although initially thought to be a woman, later research revealed that the remains belonged to a man interred approximately 26,000 years ago. What makes this burial so extraordinary is the care and ritual involved in the process. The body had been covered in red ochre, a pigment made from iron oxide, which was often used in prehistoric burial rites to symbolize blood or life force. In addition to the ochre, the burial included mammoth ivory rods, which some scholars believe may have been used in rituals or as early forms of magical wands. This discovery suggests that even in this distant period, the people of Western Europe engaged in complex religious rituals, honoring the dead with offerings and symbols of power. Another stunning example of early spiritual practices can be found in the Lascaux caves in southwestern France. Dating back approximately 17,000 years, these caves are famous for their breathtaking paintings of animals, including horses, bison, and deer. The precision and beauty of these images suggest that they were not simply decorative, but held deep spiritual significance. Many experts believe that the caves were used for ritual purposes, possibly as part of shamanic ceremonies designed to ensure successful hunting or to honor the spirits of the animals depicted on the walls. The connection between caves and spiritual practice is not unique to Lascaux. Caves have long been associated with the underworld, the womb of the earth, and the mysteries of life and death. In Druidic tradition, as well as in many other cultures, caves are seen as places of rebirth and transformation. They are where the initiate goes to confront the unknown, to face the darkness within and emerge transformed. It is no wonder, then, that caves have become symbolic of the womb, the source of life, and the potential for rebirth, a theme that resonates with modern Druidry, which places a strong emphasis on the cycles of nature and the power of regeneration. During the millennia before the rise of Druidism, Western Europe was home to a diverse array of tribes and cultures. These tribes were highly mobile, often migrating across vast distances in search of fertile land, resources, and new opportunities. Some of these migrations may have originated in regions as far away as the Caucasus in southern Russia, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, or even India. Wherever they came from, these early European peoples brought with them a rich tapestry of religious customs, many of which were animistic and shamanistic in nature. These early forms of spirituality laid the groundwork for the later development of Druidism, which would carry forward many of the same themes of reverence for nature, belief in the power of spirits, and the use of ritual to maintain harmony with the natural world. By around 6,500 years ago, the people of Western Europe had begun to construct some of the most awe-inspiring monuments ever created by human hands. These included the famous stone circles, dolmens, and standing stones found throughout Ireland, the British Isles, and Brittany, as well as similar structures in other parts of the world, such as Peru and Madagascar. These stone monuments were not just architectural feats. They were sacred spaces, imbued with spiritual significance, and used for rituals, ceremonies, and possibly even astronomical observations. Although the Druids have long been associated with these stone circles, particularly the world-famous Stonehenge, historians have debated the accuracy of this association. For many years, scholars believed that the Druids could not have been involved in the construction or use of Stonehenge, as the monument predates the arrival of the Celts in Britain by several centuries. The traditional view held that the Celts, and by extension the Druids, only arrived in Britain around 500 BCE, while the last of the stone circles were built around 1400 BCE, creating a gap of nearly 1,000 years. However, in the 1960s, many historians began to reconsider this timeline. New research suggested that the origins of the Celtic tribes were far more complex than previously thought. Instead of a sudden invasion of Celtic peoples into Britain, scholars proposed that the early or proto-Celts were likely present in Britain much earlier, possibly as far back as 2000 BCE, when many of the great stone monuments were still being constructed. This revision of history opened up the possibility that the ancestors of the Druids may have been involved in the use, if not the construction, of these monuments. One of the key pieces of evidence supporting this theory is the growing recognition of the importance of ritual astronomy in the construction of stone circles. Monuments like Stonehenge are precisely aligned with key astronomical events, such as the solstices, suggesting that they were used for ritual observances tied to the cycles of the sun and moon. This focus on celestial phenomena is consistent with what we know about the Druids from classical sources, which describe them as skilled astronomers and astrologers. If we accept that the early Celts were present in Britain during the construction of the stone circles, it is not difficult to imagine that the Druids, as spiritual leaders, would have played a role in these sacred ceremonies. The debate over the connection between the Druids and the stone circles is far from settled. Some scholars continue to emphasize the lack of continuity between the religious practices of the Neolithic period, when the stone circles were built, and those of the Iron Age, when the Druids flourished. However, others point to new research in genetics and archaeology, which suggests a greater degree of cultural continuity between the peoples of prehistoric Britain and their later Celtic descendants. This second school of thought allows us to reimagine the Druids as the spiritual inheritors of the sacred sites built by their ancestors. Rather than viewing the arrival of the Celts as a disruptive invasion, we can see it as part of a long, gradual process of cultural evolution. in which the Proto-Celtic peoples absorbed and adapted the religious practices of those who came before them. If we adopt this view, it is possible to imagine that the Druids were the priests and priestesses of the stone circles, overseeing rituals that aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. In this sense, the great stone monuments of Britain and Ireland may have served as temples where Druids performed ceremonies that honored the cycles of nature and the cosmos. As the famous scholar John Michel wrote in his groundbreaking work, A Little History of Astroarchaeology, science restored the Druids to their old temple, Stonehenge, wiser and more venerable than before. This perspective places the Druids at the heart of one of the most sophisticated religious and astronomical traditions of the ancient world, linking them to a tradition that stretches back thousands of years before their time. The earliest written accounts of the Druids come from classical writers, particularly those of the Roman world. These accounts, though often biased and incomplete, provide invaluable insights into the role of the Druids in Celtic society. Julius Caesar, one of the most well-known sources on the Druids, wrote extensively about them in his commentaries on the Gallic War, offering a glimpse into their lives, beliefs, and influence. According to Caesar, the Druids held a position of great power and authority within Celtic society. They were not merely religious figures, but also scholars, philosophers, judges, and advisors to tribal leaders. The Druids' influence extended into many aspects of Celtic life. They were responsible for officiating at religious ceremonies, including sacrifices, and were said to possess deep knowledge of natural law and the cycles of the cosmos. According to classical sources, the Druids taught their followers a belief in the immortality of the soul, a doctrine reminiscent of the Hindu concept of reincarnation. Caesar noted that the Druids believed that after death, the soul would pass into another body, and that this belief gave them great comfort, particularly in battle. Diodorus Siculus, another classical writer, emphasized the Druids' role as scholars and teachers. He described them as custodians of a vast oral tradition, which was passed down through the generations without being committed to writing. This oral tradition was composed of verses, some sources claim as many as 20,000 tars, that students were required to memorize. These verses likely contained the teachings of Druidic philosophy, natural science, and religious law, as well as stories of the gods and heroes of Celtic mythology. In addition to their spiritual and scholarly duties, the Druids also served as judges and mediators. Caesar wrote that they were responsible for settling disputes, both large and small, and that their decisions were respected by all members of society. The Druids' authority in legal matters was so great that they could even stop battles by stepping between warring factions and ordering a cessation of hostilities. This power to bring peace to violent conflicts highlights the Druids' role as arbiters of order and harmony, both in the natural world and in human society. The Druids' reputation as wise and learned individuals was not limited to the Celtic world. Greek and Roman philosophers were fascinated by the Druids, often comparing them to their own priestly and scholarly classes. Some writers likened the Druids to the Hindu Brahmins, noting their shared role as religious leaders and teachers of philosophy. The comparison between Druids and Brahmins is particularly interesting, as both groups were believed to possess a deep understanding of the natural world and the cycles of life and death. This parallel between the two traditions suggests that the Indo-European peoples may have shared a common spiritual heritage, which evolved in different ways as they spread across Europe and Asia. However, classical accounts of the Druids also include more controversial and darker elements. Several Roman writers, including Caesar, claimed that the Druids practiced human sacrifice, particularly in times of war or crisis. According to these accounts, the Druids would offer criminals or captives as sacrifices to appease the gods or to predict the future. One of the most infamous descriptions of Druidic sacrifice involves the wicker man, a large human-shaped structure made of wicker that was allegedly filled with live victims and set ablaze as a sacrifice to the gods. The accuracy of these accounts is debated by modern scholars. Some historians argue that the Roman descriptions of human sacrifice were exaggerated or fabricated as part of a propaganda campaign to justify the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain. By depicting the Druids as barbaric and cruel, the Romans could present themselves as civilizing conquerors, bringing law and order to a savage land. Other scholars, however, believe that there may be some truth to these accounts, pointing to archaeological evidence of ritual sacrifices in Celtic society, though it is unclear how widespread or common such practices were. Despite these darker elements, the overall image of the Druids presented by classical writers is one of wisdom, learning, and spiritual power. The Druids were seen as the intellectual and spiritual elite of Celtic society, holding knowledge that was passed down through generations in an unbroken oral tradition. They were connected not only to the natural world, but also to the mysteries of the cosmos, and their teachings reflected a deep understanding of both the material and spiritual realms. With the spread of Christianity across Europe in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, many of the ancient pagan traditions, including Druidism, were gradually absorbed into the new Christian faith. This process of assimilation did not happen overnight, nor was it always peaceful. In some cases, Christian missionaries actively sought to suppress pagan practices, while in other instances, they adapted and incorporated elements of the old religions into the new Christian framework. One of the key ways in which Christianity absorbed elements of paganism was through the co-option of sacred sites. Many of the places where the Druids and other pagan priests had once worshipped, such as stone circles, sacred groves, and hilltops, were transformed into Christian holy sites. Churches were often built on or near these ancient sites, a practice that helped ease the transition from paganism to Christianity for the local population. In this way, the sacredness of the land was preserved, even as the religious practices associated with it changed. Similarly, many pagan festivals were Christianized, with the most notable example being the celebration of Christmas. The birth of Christ was originally celebrated in the spring, but over time, the date was moved to coincide with the winter solstice, a major festival in many pagan traditions. This merging of Christian and pagan practices created a rich and complex religious landscape in which elements of the old faiths survived, even as Christianity became the dominant religion. In the case of Druidism, some scholars believe that certain aspects of the tradition were preserved within early Christian monasticism, particularly in Ireland and Wales. The Christian clerics who arrived in these regions often recorded the oral traditions of the Celtic peoples, preserving their myths, laws, and stories for future generations. Many of the ancient laws of Ireland, known as the Brehon laws, may have been developed by the Druids, who served as judges and legal experts in pre-Christian society. These laws were later transcribed by Christian clerics, ensuring that they would not be lost to history. In addition to the legal traditions, the mythology and stories of the Celtic peoples were also preserved in Christian manuscripts. Texts such as the Irish Lebor Gabala Erin, Book of Invasions, and the Welsh Mabinogion contain rich accounts of the gods, heroes, and magical beings of Celtic mythology. These stories have become a central part of modern Druidry, which draws on the wisdom and teachings of the ancient bards and seers. One of the most interesting examples of the blending of Druidic and Christian traditions is the figure of Saint Brigid, the patron saint of Ireland. Saint Brigid is widely believed to have been based on the pre-Christian goddess Brigid, a powerful figure associated with fertility, healing, and the hearth. The transformation of a pagan goddess into a Christian saint reflects the complex interplay between the old and new religions, as well as the ways in which elements of Druidism survived within the Christian tradition. By the 17th century, interest in the Druids and their mysterious monuments had begun to reawaken among scholars and antiquarians. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and empirical observation, sparked a renewed fascination with the ancient past. Scholars began to study the stone circles, dolmens, and other megalithic structures that dotted the landscape of Britain and Europe, seeking to understand who had built them and why. One of the key figures in this revival of interest was William Stukely, an 18th century antiquarian and scholar who was often regarded as the father of British archaeology. Stukely was captivated by the ancient monuments of Britain, particularly Stonehenge, and he was one of the first scholars to suggest that these structures were connected to the Druids. In his writings, Stukely argued that Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments had been used by the Druids for religious ceremonies and astronomical observations. Stukely's ideas were part of a broader intellectual movement known as the Druid Revival, which sought to reconnect with the spiritual and cultural heritage of pre-Christian Britain. This movement was driven by a desire to uncover the wisdom of the ancient Druids, who were seen as philosophers, scientists, and priests. The revivalists believed that the Druids possessed a deep understanding of nature and the cosmos, and they sought to revive this knowledge in their own time. The Druid revival had a significant impact on the development of modern Druidry, as it helped to create a sense of continuity between the ancient Druids and their modern descendants. Many of the ideas and practices of modern Druidry can be traced back to this period, including the emphasis on nature worship, the celebration of the solstices and equinoxes, and the use of ancient symbols such as the Triscale and the Ogham alphabet. Movement. Cultural Druidism, particularly in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, played a significant role in preserving the languages, traditions, and folklore of the Celtic peoples. Festivals such as the Welsh Eisteddfodau, which celebrated poetry, music, and the arts, became important expressions of cultural Druidism and helped to keep the Celtic languages alive. At the same time, fraternal Druidism emerged as a social and charitable organization, similar in many ways to the Freemasons. These fraternal orders, such as the Ancient Order of Druids, focused on mutual support, fellowship, and charity, but they also incorporated elements of Druidic symbolism and ritual. Although fraternal Druidism was primarily focused on social and charitable work, some members began to explore Druidry as a spiritual path in its own right. The modern spiritual movement of Druidry, which we are familiar with today, began to take shape in the early 20th century. Figures such as George Watson MacGregor Reed played a pivotal role in promoting Druidism as a distinct spiritual tradition. MacGregor Reed's ancient Druid order became a vehicle for conveying many of the ideas of the Druid revival, as well as the esoteric teachings of groups such as the Theosophical Society and the Order of the Golden Dawn. The modern spiritual movement of Druidry, which we are familiar with today, began to take shape in the early 20th century. Figures such as George Watson MacGregor Reed played a pivotal role in promoting Druidism as a distinct spiritual tradition. MacGregor Reed's ancient Druid order became a vehicle for conveying many of the ideas of the Druid revival, as well as the esoteric teachings of groups such as the Theosophical Society and the Order of the Golden Dawn. One of the most influential figures in the modern Druid movement was Ross Nichols, who, along with Gerald Gardner, the founder of modern Wicca, helped to establish the foundations of contemporary paganism. Nichols was deeply inspired by the work of Robert Graves, particularly his book, The White Goddess, which explored the idea of a druidic tree alphabet and the role of the goddess in Celtic mythology. Nichols's work helped to shape the rituals and practices of modern Druidry, including the eightfold cycle of festivals that is now central to both Druid and Wiccan traditions. In recent decades, Druidry has experienced a renaissance, attracting new generations of followers from around the world. Modern Druidry is a diverse and inclusive movement with a wide range of beliefs and practices. Some Druids focus on environmental activism and nature conservation, while others are drawn to the spiritual and philosophical teachings of the ancient Druids. Many modern Druids celebrate the cycles of the seasons with rituals and festivals that honor the solstices, equinoxes, and the changing rhythms of nature. One of the key themes of modern Druidry is the reverence for nature and the recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. Druids see themselves as stewards of the earth, responsible for protecting the natural world and preserving its beauty and diversity for future generations. This emphasis on ecological responsibility has made Druidry a natural fit for the environmental movement, and many Druids are actively involved in campaigns to protect sacred sites, wildlife habitats, and endangered species. At the same time, modern Druidry continues to draw inspiration from the ancient wisdom of the Celtic peoples. The stories of the bards, the myths of gods and heroes, and the teachings of the ancient Druids are all part of the rich tapestry of modern Druidic practice. These stories and teachings provide a sense of continuity with the past, while also offering valuable insights for living in harmony with the present. In conclusion, Druidry is not a static tradition frozen in time. Rather, it is a living and evolving spiritual path that has grown and adapted over the centuries. Just as the Druids of old drew on the wisdom of their ancestors, modern Druids continue to seek out new sources of inspiration, whether from the natural world, ancient mythology, or contemporary scholarship. Far from being a relic of the past, Druidry is a vibrant and flourishing spiritual tradition with a global presence and a growing community of followers. We hope you enjoyed your journey learning about ancient Druids. If you could do me a favor and subscribe, That would help this channel grow a lot. And our goal is to reach my first ever 10,000 subs. Thank you so much.